Hi everyone! So it is officially full-fledged springtime now, and I am super excited about that, as is our bird friend, in case you can't hear him. I'm sure he will be joining us for the whole video again, as he has done in recent videos. But part of the reason I'm super happy about it being springtime is this is the time of year when my plants really start to kind of pick up a bit in terms of growth. However, this is also the time of year when we tend to do more repotting than any other time of year of our houseplants. So I thought it might be helpful today to do a video basically on some common houseplant repotting mistakes that I've seen. Now, I do want to point out up front that this is basically just houseplant repotting advice, guidelines, whatever you want to call it. There will always be exceptions to the rule, but as we go along today, I'm going to cover kind of some of those exceptions for you. But the first common repotting mistake I want to talk about today is repotting too soon. So a lot of the guidance out there states that if you see roots coming through the drainage holes on a pot, then that means it's time to repot that plant. This is not always the case. Syngoniums is an excellent example to kind of prove that this is not always the case, because when you take a syngonium, for example, that you've been propagating in water and you pot it up, syngoniums, for whatever reason, like to send their roots straight down to the bottom of that pot right away before spreading out anywhere else inside of that pot. And then, of course, because they're already at the bottom of the pot, they will start to come out of the drainage holes. I guarantee you in these situations, if you take that plant out of a pot, it will have roots coming out of the bottom of the drainage holes, but there will be no more roots higher up. So when you do not have a lot of roots all the way surrounding in that pot, that plant really does not need to be repotted yet. It's really only when a plant becomes root bound that you want to repot. Now, I do want to clarify here right now that root bound can actually be several things, in my opinion. So typically this is kind of what we think about when we talk about root bound. The roots are all up in that pot. There's no more soil for them to spread into. And of course, when a plant gets that way, you typically will start to eventually see roots come out of the drainage holes. However, in the case of plants like syngoniums, where the roots just want to go straight to the bottom, sometimes they will just continue to grow and wind around in the bottom of that pot. And they will start to just press harder and harder against the edge of that pot, and they'll never spread out higher up. That, in my opinion, is also considered root bound, because in the case of some of those plants, they are pushing so hard and have wrapped so many times around themselves that they start to bulge the plastic of that pot. And that means it's time to do something about it and repot that plant. Now, while we're on the subject of repotting too soon, I want to take a moment to talk about should you or should you not repot a plant right away when you first bring it home? All of the guidance out there will tell you do not repot it right away, because the plant is going to be stressed from getting moved from an environment to a new environment, and it needs time to acclimate to your house. I have stated time and time again on my channel that while that is good general guidance, that does not always hold true, and sometimes if you don't repot a plant right away when you bring it home, you may be running the risk of potentially killing that plant. So why? Well, there are several reasons. Number one, oftentimes when we buy plants from the store and we bring them home, they're not necessarily in the best type of soil for the plant. If it is in a very peat-heavy soil, for example, without any extra drainage added to it, so like no perlite, nothing to give it better aeration, and even if it's a plant that is like, for example, a calathea that likes to stay more on the moist side, sometimes really peat-heavy soils without extra drainage like that, it's still going to be too much and you're risking suffocating the roots. Now remember, they also typically have been in more ideal conditions in a greenhouse type environment when we buy them, depending on where you buy them from, of course. And when we bring them home, our house is not as ideal. So frequently they may have been fine in that substrate because they were using up the water quickly enough in the environment they were in before, but now perhaps they're not getting as ideal of light levels in our homes, and so they're unable to use up that water as quickly. That soil stays wet too long, and then you run the risk of root rot. So I always advise you that if you buy a plant, it is not in the correct type of soil, and you get it home, repot it right away, put it into the correct type of soil, because the potential for it to start to go downhill while trying to acclimate for your house in terms of its root system is greater. So I think it's better just to repot it and get it into that better substrate right away. Now, a few other examples of when you might want to repot a plant the second that you bring it home. If you slip it out of its pot, which I highly recommend doing at the store before you actually buy the plant, but if you forget, make sure you slip it out when you get it home. You always want to check the roots on any new plant that you get for two things. First of all, root rot. We want to make sure there's no root rot. If you see signs of root rot at the store, don't buy the plant. Just don't put yourself through that headache. But if you forget to check at the store, you get it home, you slip it out, and you see signs of root rot, then you're going to want to treat for that root rot. And quite frequently, that can involve removing all of the substrate, removing any of the damaged roots, giving it a root rot treatment. I usually use a mixture of 2 parts water to 1 part hydrogen peroxide to rinse those roots down, and then pot it up in fresh new soil. That is reason number 1. Reason number 2 is if you discover, which I feel like we are not seeing this as much anymore. Feel free to comment down below and correct me if you are seeing this a lot still. But for a while, a few years ago, a lot of the vining plants that you would find in, for example, big box stores were not highly rooted. It was like a lot of barely rooted cuttings jammed into a 6-inch pot, which was really honestly too big for them. So if you do find that it is just like barely any roots, a ton of cuttings, and maybe also it's in bad soil, but even if it's in good soil, I would highly recommend repotting it right away when you bring it home. And I also, in that instance, might recommend down potting it. So what I mean by down potting is taking it into a smaller pot, because lots of times when they have all those barely rooted cuttings in a 6-inch pot, it's really just too much soil for the amount of roots that are in there, and then you have just excess soil that stays wet longer. And once again, this kind of creates the ideal environment for the development of root rot. So I would take it down to probably about a 4-inch pot if you can, and then you want to begin going through the regular process of letting it acclimate to your home. But if you don't see any problems of that nature, then by all means, wait to repot it, let it acclimate to your home. It should be fine. But while we're on the topic of incorrect soil type, that is another common mistake I see when people repot houseplants. They don't put the plant into the correct type of soil, or they don't add enough extra drainage amendments such as perlite, pumice, bark, horticultural charcoal, those kinds of things, to allow enough oxygen flow to the roots. Now, on top of this, I also sometimes see people take a plant that's in, for example, a highly just peat-based mixture, and they just leave all that peat-based mixture around it, and then they put it into a completely different soil type, for example, an epiphyte mix. This is also a recipe for disaster. And before I forget, if you're not sure what type of soil mix is best for a specific type of plant, I do have a video about that. I will link it down below in the description for you. But basically, you guys, if you have something that is like a super heavy peat mixture with no extra drainage, and you put it into a super chunky aeroid mix that's got a ton of extra drainage, what's gonna happen is when you water that plant, the original substrate around the roots is going to stay wetter longer than that epiphyte mix that's now outside that root structure. So you're going to probably base your watering off of, oh, the epiphyte mix is dried out, when in fact, all of that peat substrate that is in the center of that plant is still sopping wet. And once again, this will lead to root rot. You know, I'm realizing right now, you guys, there's a lot of repotting mistakes lead to root rot. So just be aware of that. And since we are talking about repotting mistakes that lead to root rot, let's talk about another big one next. So the next repotting mistake I want to mention is choosing the wrong pot size for the plant. So we do want to typically go up only what we say is 1 pot size larger when we're repotting a plant. When we say 1 pot size, we mean basically 2 inches. So if it's a 4-inch, you want to take it to a 6-inch. If it's a 6-inch, you want to take it to an 8-inch. This is good general guidance, you guys. And for plants that don't have super fast growing root systems, 100%, this is what you're going to want to do. However, some plants have roots that grow crazy fast, and if you only take them up 1 pot size, you're gonna find you're having to repot that plant again like 3 or 4 months down the line. So for example, rhizome-based plants, such as like any kind of prayer plant family plant, so Maranta, a Calathea, a Tenanthia, a Stromanthe, their roots grow crazy fast, you guys, because they are rhizome-based. And that rhizome, reminder, is an underground modified stem. Its goal out in the wild is to keep spreading out as far as it can and then shooting up new plantlets as it spreads out underground. And so everywhere it spreads, it's pushing out basically an entire new root structure below each of those little plantlets. So that is why they become root bound way more quickly, at least in my experience, than some of my other plants. So for those plants, sometimes I would recommend going up 2 pot sizes, because that way you're not going to have to repot again as soon. I will show you a perfect example right now. We just barely repotted this plant, like I feel like maybe 3 months ago, and as you can see, it already has an insane number of roots spreading around in that pot. It is actually gone to the bottom with the roots and is starting to push the whole plant up and dirt outside the pot. So honestly, I probably should have gone one more pot size larger when I repotted that plant. But in this particular instance, you guys, you kind of have to use your best judgment. If you're new to plants, you might not know. So just for your first time repotting a plant, just go up one pot size. If you find that, man, it looks like it's doing some funky things that make me think it needs to be repotted again, like I'm gonna check the roots, and you find 4 months later that it's super root bound again, well then you know. So when you repot it the next time, take it up 2 sizes. Some of this is just something you kind of have to learn, but once you've learned it, just keep a mental note that those fast rooting plants, let's just go ahead and take them up to pot sizes, because as long as we've got them in the right substrate, the right kind of pot, which we're going to talk about that next, we've got them in the right kind of light, then everything should be good to go. Oh, and before I forget, drainage holes. Make sure, especially if you are new to plants, that you are using pots that have drainage holes. If you can't find pots with drainage holes that you like, so let's say you're out shopping, you find this gorgeous ceramic pot and you love it, there are no drainage holes. You have several options here. You can actually buy special drill bits to create your own drainage holes, or you can do what I prefer to do, which is just leave my plants in nursery pots, preferably clear ones, so I can keep an eye on how the roots are doing, make sure there's no root rot happening or anything like that, and then just set it inside of that cute little cover pot that you found that had no drainage holes. Now, it is possible, you guys, to grow plants in no drainage. I do have 2 plants, actually 2 of the first plants I ever owned, 2 succulents that have been growing in these containers with no drainage the entire time I've had them. Had them for, actually I think I've had them for, it'll be 4 years in September, I think. They've been in those pots for 4 years. I haven't even repotted them, you guys. Like I have beheaded them, propagated them, let them start to grow again in that pot. But literally they've been in that pot for those pots for 4 years, not repotted, no drainage, and it's done fine. I will try to do a separate video for you guys on growing in no drainage and kind of like how I do it. But honestly, if you don't have to do it, just don't do it, because there's still a risk. I might screw that up one day. It's gone good for 4 years, but who knows? So really, honestly, especially if you're new to plants, just stick to pots with drainage holes. Okay, so another thing I want you guys to keep in mind, because this is a common mistake that I see, especially amongst like new plant parents. I myself committed this sin recently. We'll discuss that in a second. I thought it would be okay. It's gonna be okay. It's getting to the okay point, but the plant, you'll see. The plant's not done well in the transition process, but that's okay. It's gonna be fine. But this next mistake is planting the plant when you repot it either too high in the pot or too low in the pot. So ideally, when you're going up a pot size or more, you do wanna have some soil beneath the plant when you put it in there. You don't want to just take it straight out of the pot it was in and just stick it down into the base of the new pot with nothing underneath it. Ideally, you want to do at least a few inches, if you can, of soil or whatever substrate you're using at the bottom there before you put that plant in. But once you do that, you want to make sure that the crown of the plant, so where the plant comes out of the top of the soil, you want that to sit a few inches below the top of the pot. So if you're putting 2 inches worth of substrate in the bottom of the pot and you set the plant in there and now the crown of the plant is sticking up out of the pot too high, well, that's not going to work. And if the only way you can get that plant to sit about an inch or so below the top of that pot is to not put soil under it, then you need to get a deeper pot to use. Now, the other thing is you want to be very careful not to put a plant too far down. So if you are going up, for example, 2 pot sizes and you put a couple inches of substrate in the bottom of that pot, you set the plant in, but now the crown is like 4 inches below the top of the pot, that's too low. You don't want to bury like a lot of the stem and crown of the plant, because then potentially you get stem or crown rot. So you would want to add additional substrate below. So your goal is to always have the crown of the plant sitting about an inch, maybe 2 inches below the top of the pot. This way, when you water, you don't have like dirt overflowing out the top of the pot and off the sides and whatnot. But the other thing you want to keep in mind is you do not want to have an excessive amount of soil underneath those roots. So what is considered an excessive amount? So as far as excessive amount goes, I would say you don't want any more than third, and for some plants, a third could be pushing it, a third of that pot to be soil. Ideally, I would probably aim for no more than a quarter. So if you're looking at the pot from the side, just about a quarter of the way up is where I would stop. If you start to go higher, you run into the issue I ran into recently when I repotted my lemon lime maranta. So as you guys can see, we have some curled up, not so great looking leaves on this plant. Now it is pushing out new leaves, so I'm not that worried about it, because honestly, once leaves curl up like that, they're not going to uncurl. So as long as I'm seeing new growth and the new leaves are looking good and not curled, we're probably fine. But what caused this? Well, first of all, I just committed every repotting mistake I just discussed practically with you guys on this plant. So the first time I repotted it, I wanted it in a clear pot, but unfortunately the only clear pot I had meant that I couldn't really put soil in the bottom of it because it would be sitting too high. So I just went ahead and potted it up without putting soil in the bottom of it, thinking, maybe it'll be okay. No, not a good idea, especially on a rhizome-based plant, because now it just kept pushing the rhizome around at the base there and it had nothing under it, and it started to push itself up out of the pot, and then there was like a big old dome underneath it with nothing. So I started having problems with it killing off a bunch of leaves because that bottom part was staying too dry, even though the substrate up above it was still too damp to water. So I went ahead and repotted it, knowing that it's a fast rooting plant. I went into a considerably deeper pot than the one that it was previously in, and I thought, okay, well, it's almost about close to half of the pot, a little over a third, somewhere between a third and a half, that I had to put dirt underneath it. But because that rhizome was all wound up down there, I thought for sure it would just start to press back down around into that soil right away. It did not. So I had a little bit of a situation. The reason the leaves got curled and everything was because it was staying too wet. There was not a rot situation. It basically was just like that substrate in the bottom was just staying wet, excuse me, for too long. And so I had to kind of adjust my watering, if you will, to let the plant kind of dry out more than I normally would, because there were no roots in that lower part of that soil. So I have now seen that the roots, I've been checking on it, the roots are now starting to spread down into that soil. I am seeing the new growth pushing out and everything. So I know it's going to be okay. If it had not been a fast rooting plant like that though, it could have killed the plant. So I would have had to take it out, adjust, go into a less deep pot. So the next repotting mistake I want to talk about has to do with the roots, because there's been a little bit of, not controversy, what's the word, debate, I guess, in recent years over should you or should you not break up the root ball when you're repotting a plant. Honestly, I'm kind of the mindset now that it really just depends. It really just depends, you guys. So if it is a fine rooted plant, I'm talking like a peperomia that has very hair-like roots that are super fragile and can easily be broken, honestly, I would try not to mess with it, because that is just a much more delicate, much more sensitive root system than, for example, like a Monstera deliciosa over here that has giant, thick, chunky roots that are less likely to break if you're trying to like break up the root ball and remove substrate and things like that. But in general, you guys, my personal opinion still is it's best not to mess with them if you don't have to. I mean, roots don't get messed with out in the wild. They find their way to where they need to go. So I really do not mess with them unless it is absolutely necessary. So when is it absolutely necessary? Well, we've already talked about if a plant is in the wrong substrate, then yes, you want to get all that substrate off of there. You're going to have to mess with the roots. Just be as gentle as possible. If you discover when you go to repot your plant that you do have the start of root rot, that is another instance where, yes, you're going to have to, in most situations, you're going to want to try to remove all the substrate because it may be infected with the bacteria and everything that is causing the root rot. So you're going to want to get all of that off there. You're going to want to trim off any of the rotted roots. You're going to give it that root rot treatment I talked about earlier. And then you're going to want to pot it back up into fresh substrate. And a quick note, you guys, because we were just talking about like wrong pot size. If you do find that you have root rot on a plant and you have to remove a significant amount of roots, you're actually going to end up potentially needing to down pot that plant. So keep that in mind. If you had to remove a lot of roots, judge how many you had to remove. If it was more than like a third of the roots, odds are you're either going to go either back into the same pot size, or if it was more than that, you're going to need to take it down a pot size so that it's not in a pot that is too big. Now, another time when I will potentially kind of mess with the roots, well, two times actually. One is the instance we were talking about where the plant has just sent all its roots to the bottom and it just keeps winding them around themselves, around themselves, around themselves. I don't really like to put plants that have done that with their roots just straight into a new pot because they're already just jumbled in this one little, like, you know, this high coil. And so I find that when I do that, sometimes they're just too concentrated together. And so we run into that risk of root rot because you have a lot of soil above with not a lot of root and then soil below with no roots. So I will gently try to unwind those roots. I won't try to remove like all the substrate. I just try to get them unwound so that they're hanging nice and loose before I put them into that pot. Now, the nice thing is most of the plants that do that have pretty thick, chunky, sturdy roots. So it's easy to do it without hurting the roots, but it is a patience thing, you guys. You've got to take your time and be patient and be careful because sometimes they've grown like under the other one and over top of another one. And so you're kind of having to gently pull all of them from different directions to get them kind of unwound. That is another instance where I will mess with the roots. The only other instance though where I will mess with the roots is if I've decided that I don't want to have to go up a pot size. And in that instance, I will do what is known as root pruning, and I will just chop off the lower quarter of the roots, put it back in the same pot, and pretty much we'll repeat that process every year thereafter because some plants, once they get to a certain size, like I just don't A, have room to keep taking them up to another pot size, and B, sometimes it's hard to find pots that are big enough for them. But the last thing I want to talk about in regards to the actual repotting process before we talk about mistakes that I see that happen after we finished repotting a plant is packing down the soil way too tight. So when we do take a plant into a larger pot, once we get our plant positioned in there, we begin the process of what's called backfilling. So we've now got that gap between the soil around the roots and the edge of the new pot. We need to fill that in. So when we're filling that in, we want to make sure that yes, we're getting all of the gaps filled in, but we do not want to just pound that soil down and pack it down super tight, because what you're doing when you're doing that is you're basically robbing the space around the roots of oxygen because you've made that soil so tight and compact that there's no room for air to kind of flow or things to breathe, basically. So how do we accomplish filling this in without tamping it down too much? Well, there is the kind of tap and slap, I guess, method, if you will, where you can just kind of tap the pot down onto the tray or whatever you have it sitting on. You can then kind of tap or slap, whatever you want to call it, the side of the pot to kind of shake that dirt down in there. Now, if you have had to untangle the roots, sometimes getting the soil incorporated fully is a little bit trickier, especially depending on your substrate. If it's like a big chunky substrate, sometimes it's hard to get things down around in those roots. That's when a metal chopstick of sorts comes in handy. You can use that to kind of gently poke around and get the soil to fall down into those gaps around the roots. Also, you can use this if you haven't messed with the roots to also help kind of get the soil down into all the spaces between the root ball and the edge of the pot. But if you are actually, once you get to the top of that, filling that pot in, if you are tapping that dirt, just lightly tamp it down. Do not pack it down too tight. Okay guys, so you have successfully repotted the plant. You have not made any of the mistakes we have discussed so far. You think you're in the clear. Well, hopefully you are, but honestly, there are a few mistakes I see that people make frequently after repotting a plant that can lead to that plant's fast decline. And the first one is fertilizing that plant right away. When you guys repot a plant and you're giving it a fresh substrate, that substrate still typically has a high nutrient value to it, high enough that the plant doesn't really need anything added at that particular moment. Also, if you're using any kind of store-bought potting soil in your mixture, your substrate mixture that you're using for a plant, almost all of the store-bought potting soil mixes out there right now on the market, at least most of the ones that I see in my area, have slow-release fertilizer in them. So they already contain fertilizer. You don't need to fertilize on top of it. But even if it didn't have that, like, you have to remember you're giving the plant a little bit of a shock, right? By taking it and repotting it. If you had to mess with the roots, you're giving it an even bigger shock. If it had root rot, that is the biggest shock. You do not want to then incorporate fertilizer in there and the plant be like, I'm so shocked that I don't even know what to do with this. And then you run the risk of fertilizer burn to the plant in terms of its foliage and or its roots. So just back off the fertilizing. Don't worry about it. I would say for at least a month, just let it be. And then if you see that the plant is actively starting to grow again, it seems like it's doing fine, it seems like it is fully recovered from its repotting experience, then start fertilizing again as you normally would. Now, another big thing that I see, like, oh my gosh, so much after repotting a plant is not putting it into the best light. So if your plant is a low light tolerant plant and you've had it living in a low light situation, great. However, as soon as you have repotted it, I honestly would recommend putting it in a slightly brighter location. I'm not talking crazy brighter. We don't want to cause extra shock from it being like, oh my God, you took me from a north facing window to a south facing window. No, but somewhere where it can get a little bit more light than it normally does, just until it starts to kind of kick off more root growth and you start to see additional growth coming up top in terms of the foliage. But really it's about the roots, you guys. Once you kind of see like more roots growing around. And once again, this is why I really recommend like clear see-through nursery pots for plants and then just putting them inside of a cover pot, because that way you can check and see. If you see roots starting to grow actively, then move it back to its lower light situation. But sometimes when we are in a low light situation and we repot, it's not enough light for the plant to really start to kick off that new root growth. And then you have that situation where that new soil that you put in there where there is no roots might potentially be staying wet for too long and you're running the risk of root rot again. So I really just advocate giving the plant like ideal conditions for at least a few weeks after you repot it and then put it back where it normally lives. Now, another thing is that a lot of people don't think about the fact that you're not going to have to water that plant as frequently when you have just repotted it into a larger pot than you did before. So I have said it 1,000 times before, we don't water on a schedule, right? We water when the plant needs it. And that's how we should always do it. But the thing is sometimes, I'm sure you guys know, even though you always water a plant when it needs it, you just get used to when your plants typically need to be watered. So for example, I know this Monstera deliciosa needs to be watered approximately every 14 days. Now that will change here in the next few months because the windows behind you are southern facing windows. So up until this point of the year, we've been getting direct light coming through these windows. So this plant's been getting a lot more light than it's going to get over the course of the next few months when the sun starts to track more north in the sky and will no longer get direct light coming through these windows. So then I won't have to water this plant as frequently as I currently am. Well, the same holds true when you repot a plant. So if you have taken it into a larger pot, and let's say typically you have to water it once every 5 days, don't just go on auto schedule and be like, oh, it's been 5 days, I'm sure I need to water this plant, I always water it every 5 days. No, be sure to actually check it. Is the substrate dried out enough for that particular plant type? Stick your finger down in there, pick up the pot. Does it feel lighter? And that's another thing. A lot of us will judge not only by like, does it feel dry enough, but we can tell because the pot feels so much lighter. But once you've repotted a plant, that plant is now in a bigger pot, so it's naturally going to feel heavier. So you've got to kind of relearn what light enough feels like. So pay extra special attention to if your plants have actually dried out enough to warrant watering them after you repot them, because you may find you have to go a lot longer. And the immediate weeks after repotting, you may find that you're going way longer than you're going to have to a month after repotting it when the plant's kind of recovered from its transplant shock and it's actually actively growing the roots and the leaves and everything again. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in terms of common mistakes that I see when it comes to repotting, and I honestly feel like this is the biggest one ever. It is also the one that is just so easy for us to do as plant parents, but don't panic if you see something going wrong after you've repotted your plant. And more importantly, don't make panicked decisions to do certain things when you see things going wrong. So for example, once again, my lemon lime maranta, I knew I had done wrong. I knew I had done wrong, but I also knew that the plant could recover and it would be fine if I just adjusted the one thing that I knew I had done wrong and was more careful with letting that plant dry further out. It is recovering now, it's doing fine. Now, another good example of this is if a plant starts to like lose more leaves than normal right after you repot it, that is not uncommon. Even if you don't mess with the roots, you guys, you're taking the plant out of a pot it was mostly happy in. I mean, if it was super root bound, maybe it wasn't too happy and that's why it needed to be repotted. But you're putting it into a larger pot. It's going to have more soil around it. That soil is going to stay a little bit damper just naturally because there's no roots growing into it yet. It is a process. It's going to shock the plant in some way. It's going to need some time to adjust. So if you see leaf loss happening right away, just don't panic. If you see this going on for more than a few weeks and it's not starting to improve, then maybe, yes, something's gone wrong. In that situation, the number one thing you want to do is slip that plant back out of that pot and check those roots and make sure that you haven't gotten the start of root rot for some reason. Because typically, if something goes wrong when you're repotting a plant that's going to lead to the demise of that plant, I guarantee you, like 99% of the time, it's going to be because something has happened to those roots and something not good, most likely root rot. And if that is the situation, then you just have to go through the process of trying to treat for that root rot, and you may find that you need to downpot that plant. But just try not to panic right away and start doing crazy things that might make the shock and everything the plant's going through even worse. But I hope you guys have found this video helpful today. If so, please be sure to click that like and or subscribe button down below, and I look forward to seeing you guys again next time. Aloha!